Welcome to The Last Human Voice. I'm Dr. Mathilde Pavie, a lawyer and expert in intellectual property, ethics and AI.
I'm Marcus Hutton, actor, voice artist and chair of the Equity Audio Committee.
And I'm Annette Rizzo, a voice artist and union activist on a steep learning curve.
Together, we explore moral, legal and ethical issues surrounding AI in the creative industries.
We talk to artists and activists, performers and policymakers, people from across the world, whose experiences are shaping the response to artificial intelligence.
And we look at how AI affects us all, down to the very last human voice.
In this episode, we're talking to Dr. and Professor Dominic Lees, Associate Professor of Filmmaking. And for once, we've all met our guest in the flesh before coming to the recording studio. So I think that's a first on the podcast.
Yeah, I think it is. It turns out that Mathilde and I have both worked with Dominic. We had one of those moments of, I think we should talk to Dominic. And I said, Dominic Lees, that Dominic Lees, that Dominic Lees. We both worked together in the rather glamorous academic setting. I am still brushing off the fairy dust of Farnborough College of Technology.
And for me, it was at the University of Reading. And I shouldn't really use the past tense because Dominic and I are still working together very closely on the topic of AI in the film industry. And Marcus, you've met Dominic at the conference we've organised with the Synthetic Media Research Network last summer.
Yes, I did. And absolutely fascinating it was. Apart from feeling terribly sort of like, I came with my sort of activist hat on, and here were all these very, very clever people with PhDs. I felt sort of like, oh gosh, I felt a bit out of my depth in some ways. But, and also I had, it was very interesting because I think there were parts of that conference that really clarified my thinking, particularly when you put up some examples of AI or good or bad uses of AI. And I had a sort of really visceral reaction to one piece, which at the time felt like an overreaction, but it made me really cross. And I got home and I realised what it was that bothered me about AI. So that day really clarified a lot of my thinking about some of the downsides of deepfaking.
And I think that was about digital resurrection, which ties into some of the conversation about AI in the context of deepfakes and filmmaking, face replacement and all that we want to talk to you about today, Dominic. So, Dominic, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you join us on the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here.
Now, before we go diving into a discussion about your AI film work, let's set the professional background.
Right. Well, Dominic studied film, first in Poland and later in England, where he finished his training as a director at the Northern Film School. Dominic went on to have a thriving career as a director, which included TV commissions for film and for Channel 4 films and for television. Dominic's feature debut film was the film Outlanders, which won 5 awards at international film festivals and sold internationally.
Dominic is now Associate Professor at the University of Reading in the Film and Television Department. His most recent scholarship and expertise is in generative AI in the screen industries. He's published several scientific publications on this very topic, as well as being lead writer on AI for the British Film Institute's magazine Sight and Sound. As an academic, he leads investigations on the creative potential and ethical practices of AI in film. One of his lines of scientific investigation has been the impact of the digital replacement of actors' faces in film using AI, also known as deepfakes. Between 2019 and 2020, Dominic led a project where a team of researchers sought to deepfake former UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher into a short fiction film exploring the impact of her policies in people's lives. And we are going to say more about this project in a few minutes' time. And as well as all that, he has founded and directs a research network on AI in the creative industries called the Synthetic Research Media Network. And you won't be surprised to hear that as a result of all of the above, he has been invited to make regular appearances on radio and TV to share his expertise.
Dominic has also been appointed as the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee as a specialist advisor to their inquiry into British film and high-end television. Now, the inquiry is not exclusively focused on AI, but we expect the topic of AI to feature as part of these discussions. And we hope to get all of the good scoops about this topic from you, Dominic, as soon as they come out. Exclusives, please. One of the reasons we wanted to talk to you, Dominic, is because you're coming at the question of AI in screen media from a different perspective, and actually more than one. You have a film and TV director hat, you have an academic researching and teaching filmmaking hat as well, and you have now, as of more recently, you have a specialist advisor to the UK government hat on. So it's practice, it's teaching and research, it's policy, and we hope to tap into all of your hats and brains today.
It's a lot of hats.
It is.
Yeah, there's a lot of hats.
Okay, the hat that I'm not going to reveal much about at all is the House of Commons Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport, because a lot of our work is underway at the moment and is highly confidential. So until the committee produces its report, I can't be very forthcoming.
Fair enough. Confidential hat.
But on that day, we'll be first out the gate with you then.
Sure, absolutely.
Now, after all that, I feel like I should actually be asking you, Dominic, which 10 songs you'd like to take with you to a desert island. But that's not what I'm going to do. Let's talk first about the Deepfake Margaret Thatcher project, which was nicknamed Virtual Maggie. We're going to hear more about it in detail, I hope. But first of all the people you could resurrect, why choose Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I had written a spec feature film script, which hadn't been made. And at the time, I was still hoping I might get a producer involved in the project. And that was called Rebel Bus, and it was set during the 1980s. It wasn't about Margaret Thatcher at all, but she had a small part in it. The story of Rebel Bus is actually set in Wales, and it's about teenage football fans who are desperate to go and see their Cardiff team play in their Champions League match, which is picked to be played in Northern Ireland, in the Bogside. And this is a true story that a minibus of teenagers and young adults drove over into the Troubles, drove right through a war zone in order to follow their football team to the match. And Margaret Thatcher in the script had a small part, 4 or 5 scenes. And I'd been thinking, that one's going to be really difficult to cast because if I make this film, it's going to be an independent film. It won't be very high budget. Meryl Streep had relatively recently done The Iron Lady and done the most extraordinary performance there, but we certainly couldn't afford for her to reprise her role. And then I heard about deepfakes for the first time. So that had begun in 2017, and in terms of my consciousness of deepfakes, that only emerged really in 2018-19. And I thought, there is a really interesting opportunity. Is this a technology that means that I, as an independent filmmaker, could use deepfake technology in a creative way? So I could have an actress play the role in my film, and I could deepfake the face of Margaret Thatcher onto that actress. And I was fascinated by this, and it grew out of a lot of interest that I had around technology and performance and how technology impacts on actors, and has done across history. So as I entered academia now and was becoming active in research, I thought this is a terrific research project. So I got that going with colleagues in Bristol, where I was working at the time.
So you had real human actress, and it's just about the face. And it was partly driven, at least in the beginning, by cost saving.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yep.
But also then you were excited by the possibilities of the technology. So let's talk a little bit about the technology, because you've written, obviously, from an academic perspective, you've written about the project at length and talked about how despite everybody getting very excited about the limitless possibilities, as everyone always thinks possibilities are, there are always limits, and that will inevitably impact the creative decisions that you have to make. So given that this was back in 2019, 2020, how was your experience working with the technology as it was back then?
Very poor indeed.
Oh.
I mean, part of the research project was really to experiment with the technology and what its capabilities were. Obviously, my hope was that I could create a deepfake that would work on the big screen, that could be seen in cinemas or large screens at home. I wanted this deepfake to work at high definition level. And at that time, deepfakes were being made at very, very low resolution. And the reason being, you need a lot of computer hardware to generate deepfakes. And so they were being made at very, very small scale. My ambition was frustrated because at every point I found that I couldn't upscale this to a high definition level. So this is back in 2019-20. So this was the first technical limitation. So in that you're talking about sort of what are the limitations of the technology. Some of these things I'm going to describe apply today as well. The very first one was the size of the face in the screen. The larger the size of one's face in the screen, the more pixels in that face, and the harder it is for the deep fake to generate that fake face. So the first limitation was the computer scientists that I was working with intervened with my shot list and my storyboard and said, "Oh, no, you can't have a close-up. No, you can't even have a medium close-up. Actually, a medium shot of Margaret Thatcher is the tightest we can ever see this character." And that's because he needed the face to only occupy the smallest possible part of the frame.
Okay.
And if you look at deep fakes that were current at the time, they're usually medium shots or long shots. The face never, the chin of the character is never anywhere near the bottom of the frame. It's usually a very small face within the frame. So this was the first limitation that we encountered. The second was the kind of camera angles that the deepfake technology could achieve. If you look at almost all deepfakes, you will always see both eyes of the character. You'll never see a profile. And that's because the deepfake technology finds it really, really hard to render a profile. The noses start wobbling and misforming, and it feels really quite freaky, which you might say would be quite an advantage in portraying Margaret Thatcher on film. but we were looking for a way to generate really convincing deepfakes that the audience would buy into. And that meant that the way I shot the scenes with Margaret Thatcher, and I think we'll talk about casting and working with the actor later, the way I could shoot the scenes was very, very limited indeed. So what I was learning was that this technology, despite all of our fantasies about how the technology is surely going to transform the way we can make films, the way AI will be, utterly changing in that cinematic language. Actually, it could only achieve a very few limited parts of the language of cinema. So it's actually not that useful to me as a filmmaker.
So do you feel, I know part of the whole point of it was to try out the technology, but would you, with hindsight, would you have been better off just having a human being just pretending to be Margaret Thatcher?
Now, this is exactly the discussion point, because the other thing to think about is the audience and what does the audience want to see. Does the audience want to see the historical character themselves in their film? Would they have preferred to have Margaret Thatcher play the Iron Lady, or would they have preferred Meryl Streep as they saw on the screen when the film was released? We can speculate. If I'd completed this film and released it with a deepfake Margaret Thatcher, would it have been a gimmick for the audience that was just a little bit of kind of spectacle of cinema that the audience might not have taken completely seriously, because they would have been well aware that I was portraying in a contemporary film a person who's died many years before. So there's a lot of issues in terms of our film culture about whether or not audiences want to see deepfakes at all.
Part of that may obviously be dependent on the state of the technology. So if you were doing, because 4 years, 5 years is a long time in AI. So if you were doing it now, you've already said that some of those things are still the case. Would it be a different case now? Would it be significantly better?
Yes, it absolutely is significantly better. High definition deepfakes are now possible. At the very front end of the leading technology, real-time deepfakes are possible. which is an absolutely remarkable development. There's a company called Metaphysic, which in autumn 2022 presented their spectacle to America's Got Talent. And they brought a contestant, a singer, onto the stage to sing, who stood in front of the judges, and then they drove a great big TV studio pedestal camera in front of him, and pulled down a great big screen above. And when the singer began to sing, the camera was filming him and was instantly deepfaking him on the screen above into Simon Cowell.
Oh,
Wow.
So in real time, Simon Cowell was singing.
wow.
And this is a huge breakthrough and able to be achieved at very high resolution. And Metaphysic, which is an absolutely remarkable company, the main genius behind that is Chris Hume, a Belgian deepfaker who made his name creating a Tom Cruise deepfakes a few years ago. They have now moved on to work with Hollywood. They've signed a major contract with CAA, and they're now working as the exclusive AI provider for Robert Zemeckis' new film Here. It's an adaptation of a graphic novel, also titled Here, which all takes place in one place over centuries and centuries and centuries of time. So time is extremely important, and the characters played obviously are their faces are physically transforming through that. And what Metaphysic was able to do was it was able to give Robert Zemeckis live how the actor would look if he were 98 years old or 23 years old, and likewise with Robin Wright, which is a huge breakthrough in terms of the use of the technology, because the amount of time working on that VFX technology. With deepfakes technology, that can now be achieved instantly. So it's a great tool for directors on set.
How did that impact your collaboration with the crew and the cast on set? I mean, from your normal working method, what were the actual practical frustrations when you were doing your virtual Maggie?
Well, let's go back to pre-production. The most tricky thing for me was to kind of orient myself as a director working with an actor. So I cast Ros Adler to play Margaret Thatcher. She had a particularly she had a lovely interpretation of the script and who Margaret Thatcher was. Ros has done a lot of really great comedy. She had a kind of quite a naughty comic turn that she was using to interpret Margaret Thatcher. So that was a normal director's process of choosing an actor on the basis of our common agreement about how that actor interprets the script that we're working on together. But at that casting stage, I had to say to Ros, you do realize I'm going to take away your face. Mm-hmm. The main instrument of your performance, I'm going to remove from you. And she was wonderfully bluff about this. She said, oh, it's another job, that's absolutely fine by me. But actually, it changes a great deal. Because there's a sort of, it feels very unfair as a director to be working with an actor and say, look, I'm actually going to remove your performance. In reality, what I'm doing is we will take the data of the way Ros moves her face, and we will apply that through the machine learning to Margaret Thatcher's face. So Margaret Thatcher's face will move as Ros herself has decided to play the facial performance. The audience will not be aware of Ros Adler as the performer because they are looking at Margaret Thatcher's face. And this is one of the kind of deceptions of deepfakes. It's very difficult for an audience to understand, because when an audience is looking at a deepfake character on screen, they are seeing two performers working simultaneously. So the body, the movement of the actor is exactly Ros herself. The only thing that's changed is the face. So we're actually seeing two performances simultaneously working.
Oh, and what about the audio? Was it Ros's voice? Was she doing a Margaret Thatcher voice?
No, I wanted to keep Roz's voice. She was producing Roz's version of Margaret Thatcher's voice,
Okay.
which is so distinctive.
So it's quite easy to imagine a scenario where you have three performers, or I've called it sort of Frankenacting, basically, where you've got a body, the skin, if you like, the digitally generated skin, and then a voice, or an actor's voice, which is coming out as Margaret Thatcher's voice, which companies like Respeecher can do very, very well now. So, I mean, this opens up all sorts of questions about, as an actor, all sorts of questions about agency, and which I've talked about in quite a lot of episodes about what it means to be a performer. There's two things, aren't there? It's what you agree on the day, and it's what you talk about while you're shooting. But then there's what happens in post as well. So that's another conversation, because I think I can imagine agreeing with someone on something, on how this is going to be, what it's going to look like, what it's going to be, but then it could be changed again in post. Now you can have different dialogue created, and perhaps there's an interfering force outside of the director and the producer. So there's all sorts of hands now that can appear.
Marcus, this is really interesting, because this is actually, I think, an extension of what filmmaking has always done with an actor's performance. Because we shoot many different angles of the one actor within a scene, and when we come to edit, we are able to manipulate the performance.
Of course, yes, you can.
And so that's always been the case. I mean, I've had situations where I've arrived at the cutting room and the editor looked at me and said, "Ooh, his performance was a bit ropey on the day, wasn't it?" And I said, "Yes, but I know that we can make a good performance out of this." That the editor is able to use the takes to create a performance that's a little bit different from what the actor
I agree.
themselves
I
have
would
done.
agree, but I would also say that within that, there are other things that actors can control. So it doesn't matter what angle you're shooting from, up until recently, right? There's still an element of control of what happens between action and cut. Doesn't matter what angle it's from. And of course, you can time squeeze, you can take lines out, you can switch bits around, you can do all sorts of stuff. But actors who've done a lot of television, I mean, when I was in a soap for a long time, and and it was a single camera soap, which was quite unusual. I did well over 100 episodes, and I so that became a kind of film school for me, in as much as I learned how to operate within what I could control. One of the things I could control was, if I didn't think a take was going well, I could bail. I could stop the take and say, "Oops, sorry, I forgot my line," because then I'd get another go at it. And so. But this is what I mean. These are the discussable things. I think, yes, filmmakers have always been able to manipulate, but there were still things actors could do. I mean, I've used this example of, let's say AI wants to raise an eyebrow, make you smirk in a scene, which it can do. Take your own face and sort of pull a face you didn't pull in a take, in post. I think there are a lot of actors a lot of skilled film actors who would really mind that happening, because it wasn't something that could happen before.
I think Marcus's eyebrows are becoming a thing. We've now mentioned Marcus's eyebrows in at least 3 editions. Yeah. So I'm thinking this is going to be a running theme, is Marcus's eyebrow.
Yeah, I know I keep talking about raising an eyebrow, but there's something about intention. There's something about, regardless of how much you can chop a performance about, there's still what you're doing is recording a rehearsed scene. Generally, the way you shoot wide, you shoot close, you shoot close-ups, you shoot from behind, over the shoulder, whatever you're doing on a Steadicam, you're still chopping up a piece of time and space. There's a scene, it starts at A, it ends at B, and you are kind of cutting into that with photographically. But the arc of the scene is established.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. That moment of the actor in front of the camera is the captured moment.
Yeah.
And that the audience has always assumed that when they're watching a scene in a film, that is exactly what occurred in front of the camera when the crew were all there, working and the actors were performing in front of that happened. It was real. In film studies, we talk about this with the term indexicality, because that's a real moment of lived time that is preserved on film. And these technologies are beginning to undermine that, not replace it altogether. But I think what you're talking about here, Marcus, is the multiplying ways in which that indexicality, that true moment of time,
the goalposts moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Over time, and that's. I suspect that there's going to be quite a lot of preciousness, if you want to call it that. Some actors I know who would really kick off if that happened. Be absolutely livid. And there are others who go, it's just a job, whatever.
I believe, and Matilda will correct me if I'm wrong, that Johnny Depp has a contract clause that he always includes that says you may not use VFX to alter my performance. And that came out of his experience of one day seeing a tear drop down his cheek in a film, and he had not cried on set.
Yeah.
And he found that a violation of his own performance. And in a way, I guess he didn't want to show the audience something that never happened emotionally for him in front of the camera.
Exactly. Well, that's a perfect example of my clumsy raised eyebrow analogy, but that's another example of that. Adding a tear. Another example I can think of is like doing a sex scene or doing a scene and suddenly making somebody far more sort of orgasmic than they felt that they were being on the day, or just sort of changing the nature of the relationship. That worries, but this is something that happened with Photoshop, wasn't it? I mean, I suppose the big talking point in the early 2000s or late 90s was women having their bodies, trimmed with Photoshop on every magazine they did, and that this sort of false perception of female bodies, that over photoshopping for print magazines was a big talking point, and it just feels the same. It's the same kind of conversation. I think it's quite a political conversation.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, and I want to go back to Virtual Maggie because I think digital resurrection is something that we kicked off talking about. In terms of what we were trying to do, as you do in any biopic, you're recreating someone who lived. Occasionally, it's someone who's still alive, but someone that the audience is very aware of, and you're creating a fictionalized version of that person. And Meryl Streep got an Oscar for playing Margaret Thatcher in The Iron Lady. And she was not getting an Oscar for having impersonated Margaret Thatcher really well. There were probably many, many Margaret Thatcher impersonators available out there in the market who could have done a gorgeously convincing Maggie. What she was getting an Oscar for was her interpretation of Margaret Thatcher. Her performance of the script that had been written for her. The Academy doesn't give out. There is no impersonation Oscar. But what I wonder is if we begin to see deepfaked characters of people who we remember, is this putting impersonators on screen rather than actors in performance on screen? And is that a welcome addition to our cinema culture, or will we actually say no, that's just too uncomfortable? I want to have Meryl Streep there. I don't want to have a deepfake Margaret Thatcher there. Thank you.
I always think it's a bit like putting an exoskeleton on a footballer. It's the transformative skill of an actor. It's the ability of a performer to make you suspend your disbelief. That is the artifice, mimesis, or whatever you want to call it. It's sort of artistry. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are some actors who absolutely love doing mocap work, and they love it. I mean, I would, love to talk to Andy Serkis about how he's felt, because he's given Gollum and King Kong. They are incredible performances. At Planet of the Apes, the work he's done is incredible, and he's really someone who I think would probably have a unique view on all of that stuff. But I don't know. For me, it's just not very. As an actor, it's not very attractive.
Marcus, I think the key concept is authenticity.
Yeah.
And what an actor is often striving for is to deliver an authenticity of self, of emotion
Yeah.
on stage or on screen. And technologies have always messed around with the actor's ability to deliver that authentic performance.
I think I was interested in your moral compass, in doing Virtual Maggie then, whether it has changed since, because the use of AI for digital resurrections has raised a lot of concerns. If we look at the press or readers' reviews and critiques in the last couple of years, we see a very divided kind of reception. And the digital resurrection with AI is divisive, it seems. If we take the reception of the documentary biopic Roadrunner, released in 2021, which kind of documents and retrace the work and personal life of Anthony Bourdain, where AI was used to narrate over certain shots but not others, without telling the public, at least at the moment of release, which lines were AI generated and which weren't, and which came from authentic text that he may have written and which wasn't. I think there was a little bit of blur and lack of clarity on that. So that's 2021. What were your views then on digital resurrections with AI at Virtual Maggie, and have they changed over time, or are you seeing different applications of the technology in different contexts which call for a different approach?
There's different aspects for this. The first one to talk about is our attention to data and where data comes from. Back then, in sort of 2019, we hadn't really confronted the abuse of creative data by generative AI. We were convinced that it was totally fair to take any amount of images of Margaret Thatcher and input them in as training data into a machine learning system that would create our deep fake. We never stopped to think, should we or shouldn't we use that data? Should we ask anyone for permission to use that data? I think we've got a much more attuned moral compass now about whether that is right or wrong. And certainly there's a division within the industry between those who want to carry on pirating creative data, scraping it from the internet for free, and those companies that want to have that properly licensed and properly compensated, which is something that you guys have talked about really eloquently on this podcast series. So that is a developing moral consideration around, should we deepfake? If we do, what are the morally correct terms of that process of deepfaking? But there's other major issues to think about as well. I think the perceptions of deepfakes continue to be thoroughly negative, and that clouds our ability to kind of think about the technology for its potentials. And by potentials, I mean positive. The positive value of the technology. And it's absolutely right that within our discourse, our primary understanding of deepfakes is negative because it's been used to victimize women. And the process was created for that purpose in 2017 in order to create deepfake pornography. That's how the technology began, and continues to be used in increasing volumes against women. There are some people looking for creative and positive uses of this AI technology, but we have to understand that we are the tiny minority. And in terms of I found in working on that deepfake project with Virtual Maggie, while I was shooting the scenes and then trying to work with my computer science co-I researcher colleague to actually create those high-resolution Margaret Thatchers, which we never successfully achieved, I was worried all the time, what if we make it completely convincing? I was actually quite frightened of that, because that would suddenly turn the moral microphone back on me, and I've got to say, should I or shouldn't I? And now that I have done this, now I've got the Frankenstein's monster. What do I do with it? Because that would have told me I could stage any scene I wanted with Margaret Thatcher of any sort, and your bad imagination spins off in the wrong direction, and you think, well, actually my moral compass holds that back. But there's loads of bad operators, bad actors in the field who would use it for worse and worse purposes. So I think the technology forces us to reflect internally on our own ethics, our own sense of moral values all the time.
I agree. I mean, there's an interesting tension in seeing digital resurrection, so applying AI technologies on dead people, coming across as somehow morally riskier than if we applied it to living beings. Because in law, when you die, you lose rights that would be seen as personal, attaching to your person and to you, and human dignity falls into that category. For example, privacy, personal data protection, all of those vanish, and those that survive are property rights. And for performers' work, property rights that may gravitate around the performance often belong to someone else than the performer, the producer, the director, people who produce what is perceived as tangible outputs, protected often by copyright, but not the performer. So they end up being a type of data in a way that is freer of rights, so more accessible to independent filmmaking, etc., and somehow legally freer, but somehow morally less so. And it'll be interesting to see how that discourse, how the public's approaches and understandings develop, perhaps over time.
So dead people are easy targets.
They are. They're closer to the public domain than living people. And that's interesting because from a misinformation perspective or reputation perspective, if you're still alive, you're more able to say, that's not me, or you're more able to contextualize, counter, argue, rebut, that sort of thing. When you're dead, way harder. And I think the older, the more historical the figure as well. So the more time there is between the last time the person was alive and when the resurrection is happening, the fewer rights often attach. We have to caveat that by stressing that those rights are changing country to country. They vary hugely. There's no harmonization. So legal compliance and, big sweeping answers or on the law are impossible to make. And it's interesting that we revert to the moral as a higher threshold than what the law would grant in terms of protection. I find that fascinating.
It was a resurrection of a dead boy that I had a visceral reaction to at the symposium that I came to with both of you. And it made me very angry. And I think it was just about that there was no direct consent from the person about this interpretation. And again, that's interesting because people, as you say, actors play historical characters, and that can cause annoyance as well. Churchill would never have said that. He wasn't like this. He didn't do that. He didn't, one person might say, well, we revisit Churchill and we absolutely nail him for being a genocidal maniac who killed 3 million people in the Indian subcontinent, or you make the counter argument. But the point is that the further you get away from something, the easier it is to distort history and everything else. And I find this very difficult. I find it very difficult when you're asking for children's consent, or I would imagine even great-grandchildren's consent. If you want to resurrect, if you want to kind of pull, I don't know, Jimmy Cagney out of the grave and start making new Jimmy Cagney films, who is it that's going to do the consenting? Is it going to be a great-grandchild, someone who never met him?
What's really interesting about Marcus's point here is that the video that you reacted negatively to was a deep fake of a teenager who'd been killed in a gun crime.
Yes.
And his parents wanted to make an anti-gun, a gun control advocacy video using their son. But what's really interesting in terms of your moral reaction to it, Marcus, is you knew that the parents had agreed to this, had been supportive of this, but because the boy himself hadn't been able to consent, you weren't even happy for the parents to consent for him, because you feel that he needs to be there to make the decision.
I didn't know the story. I didn't know whether they'd been strong-armed in. The representation to me felt sort of like I was looking at a video game character. It wasn't a very good deep fake. He was talking in kind of street hip sort of language, which forever set him in stone as an 18-year-old who may or may not have spoken like that at that period of his time, but I could guarantee that at 40 or 50, had he lived, he wouldn't have been speaking like a sort of young street guy, I'm pretty sure. So I don't know. There was something about, but I had to go away and calm down. It took me about a week because it made me boilingly angry. And I think probably selfishly, I was thinking about it as an actor as well. But I was just thinking, it just felt so clumsy to me. It just felt clumsy and clunky and slightly grotesque. And so it felt like hauling someone's cadaver down the street, actually. It provoked a very, very strong reaction. I'm not sure if I've still got to the bottom of it, but is something about consent here that matters. When you talk about pornography, when you talk about all rights buyout contracts and all that kind of stuff, there's something about the consent that somebody might give when they're very young, that they might want to withdraw later on. There's something in all of this that there's sort of cruelty. I think it feels cruel, some of it.
On direct consent, I think we're starting to see a new trend that I expect will only grow, of recording your wishes for your digital afterlife. This is something that's coming through from lawyers and especially in probate and will writing, to think about that, whether you're an actor or not, whether you're a public person or not. And I think it's valid. And this notion that we need to upgrade what we understand to be consent, as in it needs to be informed in order to be valid, it needs to be freely given to genuinely be consent. And consent 2.0, if you like, is the consent you can take back. And that's really hard, I think, in many industries, in the culture, in the creative industries, but even beyond, even for lawyers to be like, how am I going to write a contract that has any legal certainty if I tell you or give you the right to take away the consent, which is the very basis of disagreement, tomorrow or at any time in the future? It's not impossible. I think it's needed. It needs all of that nuance and relationality for it to be authentic and work for us. But it's a demand that is going against so many cornerstone concepts, whether in production, post-prod, distribution. Like, selling a film is on the premise that you're happy to be forever fixed in it as the performer, and everybody who's contributed to it that shows up, even your name as a director, you're happy to have your name attached to that piece and have it circulate the world and going into archives in that way.
There's two really important cases which we should talk about, which relate to what you're describing, Mathilde. And one was the project which some American filmmakers developed to cast James Dean in a new film. They made a huge splash saying that they'd had the permission from James Dean's estate to digitally resurrect him using deepfake technology in this new film. And a lot of James Dean fans, because there still are decades and decades after his death, were revolted by this because of the issue of consent. They weren't happy that his estate had made this decision. The consideration was, if James Dean had read that script, and it was a really poxy script set in the Vietnam War about a GI who adopts a dog, and people were saying, I know James Dean. I know the kind of creative decisions he made, the kind of choices he made during his life. He wouldn't have chosen to make that film himself. So even his estate shouldn't have the right to cast James Dean after his death into a new film. Now, that project folded, and nothing more went on with that. But it was a really good case of all of those issues about posthumous consent.
And we have Tom Hanks telling us he's happy to be acting forever. At the moment, he might change his mind because he's got a few years to go, I think. He's not dying tomorrow, hopefully.
This is one of my big worries about how the technology might be used. So what Matilda's referring to is Tom Hanks' discussions with his lawyers about giving permission for his deepfake to be used ever more as a leading player in television series and films. And we are at the moment at the stage of imagining that the technology really quite soon will be able to achieve that. I've already described some of the serious limitations that the technology's got, but we can kind of forecast that that will become possible. The idea of Tom Hanks being the leading man in films in 70 years' time is appalling for me. And I think it's appalling for all actors, especially American actors of the next generation, who will be presented with the idea that, sorry, you're never going to get the leading role because Tom Hanks is going to play it.
Well, also, we end up with the diversity issue. So we end up with this situation where the person who was the leading actor for this generation, arguably actually a previous generation already, is the lead actor forever. Well, what happens to, in the future, we will, I would think, socially, culturally have different ideas about who should be the lead role. Hence the discussions about whether we should have Jane Bond rather than James Bond. What about transgender, leading actors? Those things won't happen or won't happen as fast or in the same volume if you're always going to have Tom Hanks being the lead actor. So it has huge kind of implications, really. And also it touches on something that you said also in some of your writing, Dom. You were talking about the trust and consent given by the viewer, which I'd never really considered, which sounds stupid, really, isn't it? I've never thought about that. But actually, that's part of it. The viewers, the audience are giving their consent and they're trusting you as the director, as well as the actors giving the performance, to deliver something either authentic and true, historically accurate, or maybe authentic from the point of view of the way you've interpreted a work. And that's all rather compromised as well, isn't it?
Yeah, again, it's the word authenticity. You use the word authentic there, Annette, and I think that's the relationship between the artist and the audience for that art is I'm presenting something which is authentically my expression as a director. The actor is presenting to the audience their creative interpretation of a role, which is unique to them. And the audience understands that and buys into that. They want to hear your storytelling in its authentic whole.
Yes.
And these technologies might interfere with that relationship. We might find audiences. I'm speculating. Audiences might be really quite put off if they feel. That's, I know Marcus is an actor, but I don't think that's really Marcus, actually. I'm not sure I want to see that kind of, all Tom Hanksenstein playing that role. It may be that that beautiful thing that cinema has always done for us, which comes out of theatre, in theatre we have the actual body and soul of the actor working in front of us.
For now.
And cinema has tried to give that a virtual version of that on a 2D screen. If we lose that beautiful quality, maybe we're shifting the culture in a way that we don't want to go.
Do you think we're ready for it, though? Do you think the screen industries, because it's happening so fast and because, as you've said yourself already, there seems to be this quite big divide between those who just want to go full pelt into the technology and hang the consequences, and those who actually want to take the more considered and more ethical approach. Are we prepared for this, do you think? Is the industry prepared?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. The industry is completely unprepared. Technologies happen faster than the industry can think. And first adopters rush towards it and do stuff. If you talk to tech people, they say, oh, I can do this really cool new thing, and doing the cool new thing is just what they want to achieve. And they only think about it in an ethical way after the event.
Now, Dominic, I know you can't tell us anything in any great detail because you have your confidential hat on, but obviously you know what's happening with regard to the House of Commons. So how attuned are the policymakers to the needs of the film sector? I mean, I know we've said the film industry isn't ready, so it's my fear, and we have discussed this in previous episodes of this podcast, that we think that actually the policymakers are not even running to catch up. They're sort of walking at a slow pace somewhere behind. Is that your experience so far? Are they catching up?
Yes, they're definitely catching up.
Good.
For all everyone thinks that politicians are a ratbag lot and useless to us, the reality is that politicians, when you meet them up close, they are very committed. They have their interests. They're really committed to learning more, to expanding their knowledge about what's changing in the society and the economy around them. And they're really committed to thinking about policy solutions for that. So no, they're no more, politicians are certainly more up to speed than the general public. No, they're not as up to speed as experts in the field, but they're really wanting to get there. It's a completely different thing about getting policy enacted in regulation. That's a completely different game. But in terms of, are they getting there? Yes, they are.
That's encouraging.
They're running towards it.
Dominic, I think we need to move on. You are a founder of the Synthetic Media Research Network. What is it? How does it work? Is this something other people can be involved in?
Absolutely. So this is set up at the University of Reading. And what we want to do is we want to bring academic researchers and thinkers together with AI developers and creative producers working with these technologies in the creative industries. And we've got a particular focus around the performer, the moving image, but we also look at voice. And the realm of synthetic media obviously extends to text as well. So I think it's a really important thing in this very, very new area of thought, to bring together the thinkers in the ivory tower with the practitioners in companies and the creative people themselves. As going back to the beginning of this discussion, I was first interested in deepfakes as a creative practitioner working in film, thinking, gosh, there's technology. How could I use that as a filmmaker? That perspective on technology is really important. It's something that technologists themselves sometimes miss out. They go towards a technological opportunity without thinking, well, who's going to use this and why? Will anyone want to use this? What are the possible positive and negative uses of this? Technologists can be just technologically driven. So you need to get the three elements around the table: the AI developers, the creative practitioners, and the academic thinkers. And in the realms of academia, it's not just people from film studies like me, it's people from law scholars like Mathilde. Very obviously, Mathilde's been really key in launching this initiative. And we have philosophers, we have archaeologists who are interested in these technologies within the representation of ancient history, for instance. We obviously have computer scientists. But we have historians, digital humanities scholars, lots of different people coming around the table, all bringing their different angles on this discussion around generative AI.
So how do people then get involved, get in touch with you then?
They search Synthetic Media Research Network.
That wasn't complicated, was it?
No. Yeah, and you'll find a very good video of Mathilde doing a superb keynote talk in our July 2023 symposium.
And Dominic, if people want to read about your particular work, obviously beyond going to IMDb, where's the best place to find information about you specifically?
Probably the University of Reading website. If you search Dominic Lees, University of Reading, up will come the profile, and my publications and so on are all there.
Dominic, thank you so much. It's been fantastic to catch up with you. We worked out it's been probably nearly 10 years, hasn't it? It's lovely to talk to you again. And we're all looking forward to the House of Commons scoops we're going to get directly from you.
Oh, yes. You guys are a fascinating bunch to chat to. And I'm really glad that you're discussing these issues in the podcast. It's really, really interesting.
We hope you've enjoyed hearing about Dominic's work. And here comes our usual reminder and disclaimer. Yep, the lawyer's language. Here at the Last Human Voice podcast, we share our thoughts, opinions, and feelings about all things AI in the creative industries, but we do not give legal or professional advice.
And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with more in-depth AI discussion. But if you've got an idea, suggestion, or question in the meantime, then get in touch via X or Instagram, and please give us a follow if you haven't already. Search for @LHV Podcast.
And if you've enjoyed listening, and I'm thinking you probably have if you're still here, then do please leave us a review on Apple or Google or Spotify or wherever you are joining us now. Thank you for listening to The Last Human Voice. And while we may not be the last voices, we are definitely human. Here's the proof.
We hope you've enjoyed
As an academic, this is not going well.
Here at the Last Human Voice I can't even get the name right.
What are we called?
We're the last. We should say the first.
Blah.
You like the French blah, 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 blah.
Oh, no, hang on. That doesn't make sense, the sentence. That's why I can't read it.
Oh, and I got a PhD just to be doing that.